Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And Gareth, I think this is an episode we've been really excited about recording and excited about sharing with our listeners. Perhaps you'd like to say what this episode is all about?
Absolutely. So we've been planning this episode for probably coming up to a year now, but we've finally been up to the TEDR Leadership Academy at Royal Air Force Cranwell, recorded a couple of episodes up there with the team, where we got into conversations around the Royal Air Force's approach to leadership, how they're trying to integrate their concepts and their training with the wider joint force, and generally just had a really good discussion with the team up there about all things Royal Air Force leadership, management and command.
It was really excellent, and this was the first time for me going to Cranwell. I've been lucky enough to go to Sandhurst, Lympstone, and obviously I spent my time at Dartmouth. So really, really fantastic to go and visit the fourth of the branches, but also to have, as you said, Gareth, a really excellent conversation. So very much thanks to Group Captain Emma Keith and Warrant Officer Mark Willis for hosting us. But for now, we'll leave them to speak for themselves. We hope you enjoy our time at Cranwell.
So here we are in the TEDR Academy at RAF Cranwell, and we're joined by Group Captain Emma Keith and Warrant Officer Mark Willis. So thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast. Should we start by talking about who you are and what you do? So Emma, would you like to introduce what you do here at the TEDR Academy?
Yeah, hi, great. So lovely to be with you today. Thank you for taking the time to come and chat to us. As you said, my name's Emma Keith, and I'm currently the Commandant of the TEDR Academy of Leadership based here at Cranwell. Previous sort of background was as an ops support officer, but moved into the leadership space when I ran officer training in a previous tour, and then progressed this role.
Yeah, and hello, my name is Warrant Officer Mark Willis. I'm Warrant Officer Leadership at the TEDR Academy of Leadership. And my role in essence is to look after the policy, governance and assurance for training and education for the other ranks within the Air Force.
Okay, so am I right in thinking then that you've very deliberately separated commissioned officer leadership training from NCO, so non-commissioned officer training?
Yes and no. So it's probably worth just explaining a little bit about the TEDR Academy itself and our sort of overarching aim, and then move on to that question. So we're responsible for the strategic direction of leadership and command across the Air Force. So that's sort of around the what and the why of leadership, with the delivery schools looking more at the how. We help with that, but we're more focused on the what and the why. We also are in charge of coaching and mentoring. So we're the headquarters for coaching and mentoring. So just to sort of set that. Quite future focused in the sense that we're meant to be looking over the horizon for what sort of leadership we need coming up into the future. So not just on today. But to your question, yes and no. So we see leadership at all levels as a really critical part of our, I guess, ethos, our philosophy. And you're a leader irrelevant of your rank and irrelevant of the post you're in. So, for example, some people perhaps previously used to think, oh, I'm in a staff tour, I'm not in a command tour. I'm not in a leading role. Sorry, you're a member of, the Royal Air Force. You are a leader at all points. So there's that similarity that cuts across. But then there are some differences, obviously, around the training that you go through. So some parallels and some differences.
Yeah, we have kind of separate pathways for leadership training and education for our other ranks and officers, different schools, different deliverers. But the policy behind it is the same.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a very similar approach to what we saw when we were at Sandhurst with the Centre for Army Leadership. They have a very similar approach. It's always struck me as an interesting dynamic that we have non-commissioned officers and officers as two very discrete groups. But of course, as you've said, Emma, that we're all leaders in whatever jobs and roles we're fulfilling, irrespective of rank. So how do you square that circle in terms of having very specific and defined ranks, but also accepting that everybody is a leader and has the potential to influence others around them?
So an interesting point I'll comment on, I guess, is I don't think leadership is just about influencing others around you in the sense of leadership positions. Actually, somebody who is the most junior rank with no staff can lead others through how they lead themselves. So we have leading yourself as the first pillar of our leadership journey. And we break leading self into two parts. So the first part being self-awareness and the second part being self-management. So a lot of people sort of hold self-awareness up as the holy grail, like you need to be self-aware. But actually what we try to say is if you do nothing with that, that has no benefit on anyone around you, you know, knowing that you can come across in a certain way, but doing nothing about it. But under that premise of leading self, actually our most junior rank doesn't have to have a position or a role or a rank to influence. They can influence in their behaviour, in the block, in the way they manage themselves, in the way they carry themselves. They can still be a role model. So it's not just defined by what role they're in.
So I mean, I think we completely agree. I mean, the premise of this podcast is to reflect on some of these things involved and develop them. But that does seem quite difficult to institutionalize, as it were. So you can set the stall out for the value of this. Clearly, your job and the RAF wants you to sort of develop this. How do you turn that from a concept into something that people can live? Is it's up to the individual to engage in that as much or as little as they want? Or are there things you can do to, as it were, push people along that journey?
You can. I was going to say, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think just to go back and answer the question about that training and education, we have what's called a generic performance statement, which is a high-level document that our policy feeds into for leadership and command, but it sets a competency framework for each of the rank structures. So for the other ranks, it's all the way from AS1 through to warrant officer. For the officers, I think it's from officer cadet all the way through to wing command. So that sets out the competencies, how we base our training and education on, what our schools base our training and education on. To go back to the point around leading yourself, I think all our schools, our training school, our generic training schools, are linked into that. So I think they we use some profiling too, you know. So we look at 5 voices currently, you know, and that articulates to the individual. They choose their own voice, leadership voice, and that gives them an understanding, you know, an understanding of self. What makes them tick? What makes them how they react to other people's differences. So I think our training schools. Certainly the generic training schools are all very aware of that, how to develop self-awareness, whether it be with a profiling tool or through exercises, and that greater understanding of self and the self-management, as the boss said, is grown within our training schools.
And I think to add in something about the challenge you gave around how do you turn it from a concept into reality. So that ties in with we could write the best doctrine in the world, and if it's not lived, it's a waste of time, right? If it's sat on a bookshelf, who cares? It has to be lived. We have to get it into our culture and into the way that we actually behave. And so that's a huge part of what we're doing, and we're working with another team in Air Command on that. So the culture work and our leadership work are, as you would expect, utterly dovetailed and connected. But this is where things like even storytelling can be really powerful within the culture. So how do you get people to buy into it and want to do that? Well, recognising how many incredibly brilliant people we have in our organisation at every single level, in every single profession. And an example of something we did to bring that to life was we create anthologies of leadership. So we've just published the 3rd one, and it's full of stories of real leadership situations, scenarios across a broad range of areas, bringing to life our people, you know, and celebrating that and making people want to be a part of that organisation. So there's a huge part here between yes, getting the doctrine and the formal training right, but actually also the informal areas around the culture.
And I think when you look at self-awareness, as we call it, I think as you progress through your careers within the military, your self-awareness becomes deeper. I won't say get better, but it comes deeper, because I know when I was a young LAC, as they used to call them in my days, stood at the NAFI bar at Marham on my first unit. If somebody had said something slightly contentious to me, I would have probably had a face-to-face disagreement with them. Now, as nearly 60-year-old aviator, I would deal with it certainly different, and that's that self-awareness, the understanding of your ability, the understanding of the context, and it grows as you progress through your career.
I think there's a really key thing here, which is consistency as well, because in the civilian organisation, people talk about reviews, but actually many organisations I've been to, it's like, well, I haven't had one of those this year, or it was a tick box exercise. Actually building a consistency, which is, this is something we are going to do. You can still choose to engage deeply or not deeply, but at least it's very clear you're going to do this and learn as you go along. But you touched on something which I thought was really interesting, and I think something we're sometimes victim of when we have these conversations is that everyone wants to be a better version of themselves or a better leader, when the reality is everyone is different. And when we were driving up in the car, we were talking about the fact there are some people who just quite reasonably don't care about what it means to be a leader. That's not important to them. I'm imagining that as you look at the different pathways across the RAF, you're going to have some people that by nature of what they're doing are much more attuned, and some who are less attuned and say, I came here because this was a good career for me, I'll go do this. How do you adapt? And maybe this is less about the self-awareness. Maybe this is just a broader question about how do you take such a diverse group of people with different contexts and backgrounds, and as it were, bring them together under this umbrella, the common umbrella of development and growth and leadership.
So I think there's a couple of really interesting bits in there. The first is to question, not challenge, but question, how diverse are we? When you say this diverse organisation, there is huge diversity in some areas. So, for example, I think we're a brilliant organisation for social mobility. So we have a real range of people coming in with, variety of academic backgrounds or sort of personal life backgrounds. And I think that's amazing. In other ways, as is well audited, we are not very diverse, even in as simple as we're a bottom-fed organisation. So the majority of our senior officers have been in 25, 30 years and gone through the same training system. So even if we started off diverse, there's a commonality. So I think not to challenge, but just to kind of, that's an important question for us, is how diverse is it?
Well, and we should come back and talk about diversity. We had some interesting conversations recently. Please, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, which doesn't take away diversity of thought and all of those different things, but it is interesting that we go through that same sort of training system. I've forgotten the point you made now. Sorry. What was the other question? Well, got sidetracked on diversity.
You've got such a diverse group of people with different interests, and you bring them together, as it were.
Sorry, and not everybody wanting to lead. And I think that's a really interesting question for us at the moment. So at the moment, our system is set up that on the whole, you have to do command tours in each rank to promote, and you are assessed against your leadership. Now, that does become really interesting when we're looking at some of the future skills we might require. So, for example, deep cyber specialists, deep space specialists. Actually, in order to progress and have a brilliant career that's productive and fulfilling and has financial and monetary benefit, do we need those people to lead? Or actually is their skill set, this is a generalisation, but sometimes very specific and in a tech space, and we should just be allowing that path for them, in that area where their skills are? Do we need everybody to lead, or are there other people who are actually better in that space? Whereas at the minute we do force everybody through a system. Those questions are being asked and we're getting better, but there's still a journey to go. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, and I think you got a point there, man, with the generalist v the specialist. As the other ranks have developed, we've always being looked at as a specialist within professions, and the officer cadre have been looked at as a generalist because they're generally broader. But as we progress over the last few years, I think there's certainly become ranks within the other ranks that need to to be more generalist and more leadership focused. But I think I'll take it back to a leadership course that I trialed a few years ago, and I think there is an element around where we're a hierarchical organisation. So when we progress up the rank structure, we're expected to maybe take on some of those leadership roles as well. But what I'll say about the training and education within the Royal Air Force, or the leadership training and education in the Royal Air Force, is I did a course a few years ago, and I won't name the establishment, but I was the only military person on it, and I was trialing it for some of our senior other ranks. And on this course, there was bank managers. There was one bank manager of the third oldest bank in the UK. There was Lloyd's managers, floor managers, some NHS, and some others. And there was two entrepreneurs that had taken their businesses from scratch to selling as multi-million-pound businesses. One sold the business to SNCF. But what was really, really apparent, and I tested this by sending other people onto the course afterwards, but what was really, really apparent was the standard of leadership training and education that the military or that the Air Force had given in comparison to our corporate colleagues, head and shoulders above, and that was because it was incremental, and the individuals that followed me onto the course, the course professor waxed lyrical about their attendance because of the standard of leadership training and education we give.
It was almost if you're eavesdropping on the conversation we had in the car, because that to me is a really big. In fact, it's very easy to sort of declare that there's a difference in the civilian and military world, and I think when you scratch below the surface, there's not as much difference as people might imagine. But I think the one difference that as I go through my journey, I think more and more is exactly the point you've made. The military has a continuous pathway of growth and improvement, and I know a little bit more on the officer side, where you have initial officer training, and a big component of that is leadership, and then you go through your career in terms of staff courses and you grow. And what's interesting is in the military world, these are well understood. I'm going to use the word tick box, not as a generic word, but as you need to develop and grow your skills and evolve your skills to get to the highest levels. Whereas in the civilian world, and I'm sure there are many exceptions, and certainly some of the larger organizations, when you have the word CEO next to you, by definition, you now know most of the things you ever need to know about leadership. And a leadership course is often a 2-day outward bound course building a raft somewhere. I'm being actually rather unkind, but the difference is quite stark in terms of that approach. And I think this is a classic case where the civilian world says, well, of course, we're not the military, somehow implying there's something significantly different between the civilian and military world. And well, you have guns and aeroplanes, and so that means you have to be better leaders, when that's absolutely not the case. But it's hard. I mean, maybe here's a question for you, which is, here's a really difficult question. If you can answer this, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din woman. How do you convince a group of people who don't see the value of that leadership training that it is valuable? To your point, you managed to get some people in a room, and by the sounds of things, they walked away saying this was incredibly valuable. The problem is, though, people aren't sending people to these kinds of environments.
So can I just backtrack slightly before I answer that question? So I think the point about the incremental leadership training we give, okay, it's incredible. And what an opportunity. I mean, most organisations out there, if we look at officer training, don't have 6 months upfront training before you even start work to inculcate you into what we want you to be and how we want you to behave within the organisation. And then we have, every time you're promoted, whether as an aviator or an officer, you have a leadership course face to face. I mean, that's incredible. A slight challenge, though, that I would give is, what I'm conscious of is not sitting here as the Air Force or the military and sounding arrogant and that we've absolutely got this nailed. Because one of the things that I think is really important is, if we are given that amount of time, we have to be maximising it. It has to add value. It has to matter. And it has to be incremental and not just repetitive and people just sat there. So I think that's something that's really important for our organisation. And I think a couple of the things I think that we perhaps could learn from the civilian world, just to throw it out there about what we get right, but what we perhaps don't, is I sometimes sort of find myself saying, if the Air Force had a startup coming behind it that could take us over, right, like many companies do, what would we do differently? How much more agile would we be? How much quicker would we move? What more pace would we add into our decision making? How much more would we ruthlessly prioritize? Now, I'm not saying we should be in that space because we're not a business and we're not corporate, but I think we would be wrong if we just sat here going, we've got it right, because there are huge things we can learn. And one other thing, sorry, and then I'll let Mr. Willis answer your hard question, because then I can hand it over. But I think, the point that you made about actually as you've got older and you've got more self-aware, I think the majority of people, that I hope that's the case, but I think you are an incredibly self-aware person who has matured through that. Whereas I think because of our hierarchical system, some of our seniors could arguably become less self-aware because nobody tells them the truth. So there is a challenge culture as well. So I just think there's a few important counters.
Well, this might be a difficult question. You talked about where the leadership path finishes, and I apologise, I get this wrong. Did you say group captain or above? The implication was there are some ranks where there isn't a leadership path. And I thought that was perhaps a very interesting parallel with my world in the civilian world, where no one comes to me and says, listen, Chris, you're a vice president. We think you should go away and do some more training. There's this slightly odd, well, you must know it by now. So is there a slightly odd thing about that leadership never finishes? And by the way, sorry, this is the problem with these conversations, too many ideas. I think the RAF gets it right if you're worried about getting it wrong.
Absolutely.
The moment you're worried about getting it wrong, it means you're on a much safer path. And so that is very healthy. But
so to answer your question, the general performance statement goes up to wing commander, but there is work progressing that takes on that kind of pathway to senior officer. Ma'am, you're better qualified to answer the senior officer pathway. But going back to your question, how do you make it relevant to everybody? I think it's like any change program that we've ever come across. I think you've got to show the individual what's in it for them. Yeah. And I think for the question about, and we've got fantastic operators that are not interested in leadership. They don't want to progress, and that's great, because we need that technical ability and commitment and everything else. But I think the issue we have, I suppose, as an organisation, we kind of measure that what's in it for them on a rank increase or a monetary increase. And I think that's a challenge. And I think the organisation are looking at different ways on how that can progress. But ultimately, you've got to show them what's in it for them to buy into anything, whether it be leadership training and education or whether it be a change.
And that could even be, it's an environment you want to work in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a culture that you like. It's somewhere you feel safe, happy, positive. Do you know what I mean? It's, you feel recognised. So it doesn't have to be money and rank.
And in fact, we talk about this quite frequently, Ma'am, about the younger generation coming through are very values driven. The military, because of the history and the organisation it is, are very values driven organisations, and perhaps we need to be cleverer at articulating that to the people that we're coming through.
A lot of the conversation we've had up until now has been sort of talking about generalities within our understanding of leadership and how we impart and teach and develop. You talked earlier, Emma, about the importance of the narrative and the anthologies around the Royal Air Force. What makes leadership and the development of leadership in the Royal Air Force different from perhaps development of leadership in the Army or the Navy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the more obvious answer, and just to sideswerve your question for a second, but as in, the difference between us and civilian is more obvious, right? In that there's lots of commonality across leadership, but we ask our people to do things that they wouldn't be asked of in most civilian jobs. Yeah. Clearly, there's police, there's fire, there's other, what I mean? There's other, but your average civilian organisation, we ask our people to put themselves in harm's way, to potentially use and to receive lethal force. Even down to, I don't know, the civil servant on the fourth floor who has to miss their brother's wedding, or do you know what I mean? It's a whole raft of things we ask of our people that people don't normally ask. In terms of the difference from the army and the navy, you know, I guess I come from the school of thought that we have more in common than we have different. Okay, and actually I think that we forget that, and there are differences, and they're important actually for our ethos, our heritage, our culture, which we can come on to. But I think we have more in common than we realise. I did a tour with the army and I had a brilliant time and absolutely fantastic, and learned a great deal and hopefully shared a lot of my knowledge. But there might, you know, some differences, I guess, even the way we're set up. You know, the Navy pretty much operate from one part of the country, so families are stable, versus the way ours are perhaps put different pressure on people. So there are things in the structures that are different. And I think the fact we're a technical service, so even our most junior ranks are really qualified, you know, is something really interesting for us as a service. You know, we have incredibly bright organisation. And I think we're perhaps more familiar across our service. Certainly when I did my tour with the army, they found it slightly unusual that I would call my juniors by their first name, etc. Whereas that's something that's really normal to us. So there are differences, but I think there's a huge amount that's similar. I don't know, Mr. Willis, if you've got differences.
No, I think you nailed it, man. But I think I guess the difference that I see is that it's a different context, you know. And I think when you look at the juniors, as you mentioned, man, that we get in, we encourage that constructive dissent. You know, we want them to come up with different ideas. We don't just want them to follow that transactional order. We want them to bring solutions to it, you know. And I think we encourage that from a very early in rank and very early in the time in the organisation. So we want that challenge. We encourage that challenge, and I think that might be slightly different to some of the training in the other units.
I don't know the right answer for this. We talk about a joint world where the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and obviously the Marines work closely together. Would you advocate for a common approach to leadership across the services that say this is what we together represent, or do you think there is value in separating them out because of the differences? I don't know there's a right or wrong answer, but I'm fascinated because we've talked about the reason why the RAF is different, which seems really reasonable. What would you think about that?
So I think I remain open-minded and hope I continue to do so, in that, you know, actually as the services grow and evolve, like, you're always open to different ideas. But to a degree, we currently already have both. So we have a defence leadership organisation that writes defence leadership, that sort of sits as an overarching leadership structure across defence. And then we have individual services doctrine that I see almost hanging off that hanger. And I guess the way I've described it to the team is, if we're using words different to the defence leadership, that's fine, but we've got to be able to articulate why. So if defence leadership has chosen a word and we've gone, no, we want this word, okay, be able to justify that, you know, and argue why that's different in our world, why in air and space domains, you know, that leadership needs that word. If not, we should be trying to be in as much synergy as we can. Because one of the things I think is leadership can sometimes be overcomplicated. I want it to be really accessible and something that anyone can feel they can engage with. And we talk a lot about wanting a common leadership language. So actually people using sort of similar words that everybody understands, you know. So if we're using a different word to the other organisations, that's fine, but do it consciously, knowingly, and being able to justify why would be where I come from. So I think you know, a yes and no answer again, sorry.
I think there is some synergy, you know. I think we work with our colleagues in the Centre of Army Leadership, you know. And we chat to our Navy counterparts. So I think when we have, in fact, the international conference that Ted has done recently was fantastic, because it brought the internationals into the field, but it also brought the Army and the Navy colleagues in there. So we were discussing similar topics around leadership and how you train and educate, what you should be training and educating. So I think we already do that. We just do it in a single service funnel to a certain extent, but at some point they they go across. So we've just trialed a tri-service warrant officer course at Shrivenham where it's all together, and that worked well. Some of the senior programs, they have a tri-service element or a tri-service effect to it. So I think we do, but I think the business of defence is different under each of the pillars. Land is land, Navy is on the water, and the Air Force is in the air. So the contextualisation of that leadership is different, and it goes to that situational leadership.
And interestingly, the differences can add real value. So I described when I ran officer training, we had different squadrons. And the line I used to give to the squadron commanders was like, your experience as a cadet at a base level should be the same, whichever squadron you're on, in terms of how you're treated, what you expect, what you're taught, absolute base level. But actually, you can bring colour and personality to your squadron. And if that has a bit of healthy competitiveness, because you want your squadron to be best, that's great. Actually, it advocates you to push, to try harder. So I kind of see the same analogy in a way across the services. In a way, if we're trying to be, right, we need to make sure ours is really good, that's great. It's healthy competition across us all. So long as that's all it is, it's healthy. It's not, it's not trying to do each other down. It's building on what each other's done and pushing each other to be better. Then that can be a real opportunity, I think.
Okay.
I think you've convinced me that it's okay to be separate. I could tell there was a sense of we have to convince him. You touched on something a little bit earlier, just to change the topic a little bit, which is different skills and how paths for leadership have changed. Clearly, I think everyone every decade says this, we're seeing an incredible pace of change in the way the world works, and change the way that the military is working, acquiring, fighting. We've got the Ukraine conflict going on. How do you see that touching on some of the work you do, less so on what's happening in Ukraine necessarily, but more, how does that change your approach to leadership and how you teach people? One example you gave being, we have cyber people, and perhaps there's a different route or path or motivation for them. How do you see that more broadly shaping the way the RAF evolves, and particularly in the area of leadership?
I think one thing to be careful of is to make sure we're not veering and hauling constantly around today's conflict, because otherwise we're always preparing for yesterday's conflict. So making sure we're not doing that. So to me, it's broadening the picture and actually looking more at the global strategic trends of what's going on, what's happening at a higher level. And as you say, things like the pace of technical change, equally some generational shifts in perspectives and attitudes, perhaps focused around that. So some of these really big kind of global strategic trends. And I guess for me, and I think for us as a team, what falls out from that is, okay, so what skills do we need our leaders of the future to have? And the reality being that we can't train you for every situation, right? So we can't say to you, right, here's your kind of list of what you're going to do if this goes wrong. So what we have to do now is work on those broader skills. So your decision making, your judgment, your agility, your moral courage, your confidence to take a step when you don't know what's going to happen. How do you unpick that? Keith Grint runs some sessions with us around how do you find clumsy solutions to wicked problems? How do we give people confidence to move in that space where there isn't clarity? So I think for me, it's broadening the scope, making sure you're not looking at today's conflict, and then you're just going, right, what are the skills? Like how do we give people confidence to operate in that space?
Yeah, I think that's right, Mum. And I think the challenge back is around in the document that the boss mentioned earlier around leadership in defence, which was written in 2003 by a guy called Colonel Brian Waters. He defined command, leadership and management, and in essence he said leadership's about people and emotions, and that's what leadership is around. It's around people and emotions. So people change, context change, but being a good leader or an effective leader is around understanding your people, understanding their emotions and what drives them, and I think, has that changed over the last 50 years? discuss, I think, is the question. But I think from a leadership perspective, it's about understanding the context and how leadership potentially changes with a context. But that situational awareness piece, and does leadership actually change? Because I think from if you take it as the definition about people and emotions and emotions have been changing through society for years.
I mean, I wonder whether good leadership doesn't change, but when you fall into a rut of a sort of a particular perspective of leadership, that's when it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
The context hasn't changed. What we did yesterday works just as well. We don't need to worry about it, as opposed to leadership is about, it doesn't matter what the situation is. And in fact, we need to build leaders who are ready to adapt to any situation we can imagine, but actually a number of situations we haven't imagined today, because that's what will bring us success as an organization. It's really difficult. We've I don't know, we've done over 120, 130 episodes of this, and just to be clear, we still don't know how to do this properly. It's really, really hard and ever changing.
Yeah, but when you look at leadership, and the problem with leadership is it's such a broad subject, you know, and every news channel, you go on your news channel tonight or your radio station on the way home, and there will be, well, it's a failure of leadership, or this leadership isn't being good, or this person hasn't done this right because of leadership failings. And that's the problem, you know, as you can discuss around leadership being very subjective, it's also subjective at that higher level, you know. And I think it's when I did my master's a few years ago, the professor said leadership is the most discussed subject in the world. And I think it is.
It's interesting you brought up Brian Waters' sort of definitions of command, leadership and management. And we did a whole episode quite early on about what the difference between those things are. When you talk about, and Emma, you talked about wicked problems and clumsy solutions, what we're really talking about there is feedback loops and learning cultures. How much do you focus here at the Cheddar Academy on understanding the organisational culture that you're preparing people to be leaders within?
Yeah, so it's huge. And I think just to draw onto the conversation that we're having before and to link it, I think one of the really interesting things that hasn't changed about leadership is this really strange dichotomy between confidence and humility in a way, because you've got to be confident, you've got to be able to show, particularly in a difficult situation, of I'm prepared to move forward, you're safe, I've got this, but the humility of being able to say I haven't got this. And so this is this kind of constant attention's perhaps the wrong word, but you know what I mean, it's an interesting one. And I think in the current context, the humility is so important, because we've got leaders who are trying to make sense of a context that has moved so fast and technologically trying to keep up with that. The humility of getting those diverse perspectives, understanding generational differences, you know, etc., is hugely important. So sorry, just to link to that part of it, I think is massively important. And then you were saying about
understanding the organisational culture.
Yeah, sorry.
To prepare leaders for not necessarily the task, because as we've said, that's going to change, and preparing people for a range of possible tasks, but understanding the culture that they are leading within.
Yeah, so we really need to understand the culture. And actually in our team, we have a demographic of a certain age, if I'm honest, as well. So it's incredibly important. So we have what we call TEDR advocates, which are people around the organisation that we've come across, worked with, had something to do with, that we have really thought a lot of and said, right, we want you to be a TEDR advocate for us. So one, sort of helping us give our message, but actually more importantly, give us your message. We have things like reverse mentoring, where we have our juniors mentoring, you know, us and seniors, etc., to kind of, again, give those different perspectives. We engage with RAF Lead, which is our talent team. And actually, I also set up a senior advisory panel, which is people external to the organisation to challenge me and my thinking and my team's thinking. So lots and lots of like multiple injects and multiple intelligence feeds to try and see what's going on. But equally getting out of our office, you know, so not sitting in our ivory tower reading leadership books. Actually, I was at Waddington reasonably recently, you know, watching one of the latest simulation air exercises. What's the command and leadership going on there? Like, it's imperative that we stay in touch with that. And I mentioned before, there's a big culture work stand being led by Air Command at the moment, and hugely connected in with that as well, to sort of look at where we are. But somebody really clever said once a phrase that I really liked around culture, which was, you really need to understand what your culture can bear as well in terms of change.
Yeah.
And the Air Force is trying to transform really fast, and we need to transform really fast in many ways. We're brilliant and agile and incredible in certain areas, and we're awful and archaic in others, But you've got to look at the rate of which you change that culture so that the organisation can bear it. And that's a fine line, isn't it? Pushing enough, fast paced enough that back to that startup, it's chasing you, but that you don't break it. So understanding it is imperative. And our senior leadership team are a huge part of that, clearly.
And I think when you talk about organisational culture, culture, when you look at Shine's model of different onion skins and everything else, I think that organisational culture is the thing that sits in the middle as much as it can be. Take away personal cultures and so forth, but I think our organisational culture should be driven by our core values.
Yeah.
And when you look at our core values of respect, integrity, service, excellence, and the sub bullets to them, the challenge I've had recently, actually, and the boss and I have had a few chats around it, but I think our core values should be central to the organisation, and they are to a certain extent, but we don't really measure them. We don't.
Do you know what I was about to say? How do you test that the culture, the words that reflect the culture, you really live those words? We've spoken frequently, and I've been through this. I've been in many organisations where there are posters on the wall, and the CEO confidently says, "Look at our culture, isn't it great?" And the reality is, then when the pressure is applied, or when some event happens, you very quickly realise they were just posters on the wall. And so that's less about the fragility of poor cultures and more about, it turns out it's quite difficult to measure them.
Yeah, it is.
How do you think about measuring that culture? This is an audio podcast, but there was a knowing look.
So we've had conversations around it, and this is a Willis wacky idea, if you like, at the moment.
I get a lot of those.
That's trademark.
But I think that there's got to be some. You mentioned earlier about the appraisals and the way we as an organisation appraise our people. There's got to be some mechanism within that appraisal that we're measuring perhaps leadership on the core values. So who wouldn't want to be led by a leader with respect, integrity, as a service at the forefront of the thinking, and is excellent, so it's a work strand, it's work to be done, but I think, and talking about organizational culture, that's how you improve your organizational culture. We've got and the TEDA deliver what we call the TEDA Lead and Learn program, and we have high level speakers come to speak just to the Air Force. So we've had Simon Sinek, we've had Daniel Goleman. Next month we've got James Kerr, who wrote the book Legacy, and part of the thing I love in the book Legacy is about the All Blacks don't own the shirt. They play for it and they hand it over in a better position. And part of the discussion around respect, integrity, service excellence and everything that I think we should be having. And when I go out and brief to our juniors, I'll talk to them about stewardship of the organisation, because stewardship of the organisation we talk about, but we talk about it in our senior leaders. But I think stewardship of the organisation belongs to every single person in the Air Force.
So I've not heard people talk about stewardship, but it's such an interesting concept wherever organisation you're in, because I think it talks about service.
Yeah.
Which is actually a key cultural thing. But I've always thought about the military that the tradition, and I mean in the sense of the word battle honours and squadron honours and all these kinds of things, are both wonderful and to some degree a little bit dangerous sometimes. So the wonderfulness is someone saying, someone like you who was scared, worried, in a position they hadn't been, did something, and so there is a you are like them, you are part of their history, that will go with you wherever you go. I think that's incredibly powerful, to take a group of people to go do difficult and dangerous things and say, there is a history. That the all black shirt, when you put the all black shirt on, that means something. There's a danger as well that people sort of think it's about the flag, but I think your point about stewardship is so interesting. And I don't know I've ever heard that in a civilian organization, that how is your behavior and culture going to remain after you have left?
Yeah.
Because of course you don't leave civilian organizations, because that's by definition somehow a bad thing. But this stewardship is really interesting. I've got to believe that's actually quite a compelling message for people, which is, what are you going to leave behind that other people think of in inverted commas you when they put on the uniform?
And it's separate to legacy though, isn't it? Because I sometimes wonder when somebody says, what's going to be my legacy? It's not your legacy, actually, it's the organisation. And to use a really intelligent example, I don't know if you've seen Ted Lasso, but I love Ted Lasso. But in that, it's not about him, it's about the team.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful statement at the end, from entertainment, clearly. But it's not about you, it's not about your legacy. It's just, have you left the place better than it was?
And that's the point I was coming to, the change in the organisational culture, which was the discussion. The message I give to the juniors when I deliver to them is how do you leave your job, your shirt, your position in a better place for the next person to take on? And if the organisation can do that and get that right at every level, at every position, at every job, then the organisational culture will be better.
And bearing in mind, leaving it better might be stabilising it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes everybody goes in and thinks, to make it better, I've got to make loads of change, because actually I want that on my own job. Actually, maybe the right thing for that organisation has just had significant change. There's too much already going on. Maybe the right thing, back to the stewardship, is to steady it. And you should be accredited for that. So on the reports, for example, one of the things we're looking at is, for leadership, actually it's not just what you've achieved, it's how you achieved it. How did you do that? So if you broke your people and you achieved it, now there might be an occasion when that's okay, because it was life or death and you had to. If you're just at home on normal jogging and you break your people, not okay.
Right, so that's the end of episode 1 at the Royal Air Force Leadership Academy, the TEDR Academy. What did you think of that, Chris?
I absolutely loved it. And when we were doing the recording, we didn't know how long we would be able to talk. And it was definitely felt like we could have actually spent an awful lot longer. And obviously, just looking ahead to the next episode, when we carry on the conversation, there were lots of really, really interesting topics. So if you enjoyed this episode, please wait enthusiastically for the next episode dropping next Thursday. Here's some highlights of the things that we talked about. You'll hear in the next episode. The RAF's evolving approach to mission command, where commanders own the what and the why, but not the how. I thought that was a really good conversation to sort of get to the heart of that. There was also some Napoleonic history, because you just can't resist it. And I think you found a partner in Warrant Officer Willis to talk about that as well. We talk about the paradox of trust. Everyone wants it, but how many people practice it? Risks as dynamic engagement, but few practice it. We also talk about how the Air Force is building a culture fit for the future, where it both respects its roots, but thinks about how it's evolving and changing in the future. And lastly, why toxic leadership is defined by the trail it leads, not the words it speaks. So there's some really interesting stuff. We really hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you're looking forward as much as we are to next week's episode. But that's it for this week on Battling with Business. The usual rules apply. If you've enjoyed this but you haven't previously subscribed, please do subscribe to Battling with Business on your normal podcast application. And that way, every Thursday, your new episode, whether it's the standard Battling with Business or whether it's one of our influencers episodes, appears in your podcasting inbox. If you've enjoyed this episode, or you were shouting at your podcasting device that you disagreed with something, we would love to hear. The engagement and hearing back from listeners is something we really enjoy. Let us know via email, battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com, or we are increasingly posting now on Twitter and Blue Sky, which is Battling with Biz, Bisbeing with a Z. Tell your friends. Please do encourage anyone you know in the Royal Navy. They are now almost the only people we haven't had a chance to go and talk to. We're working on that. We do want to give me the chance to go back to Dartmouth and for me to show Gareth a picture of a very, very young and, dare I say it, slightly scrawny Chris Kitchener. But for now, we hope you've enjoyed that. Please do come back next week for the second part, but we'll speak to you again very soon.
Cheerio.